mostly boys in their early teens, were disappearing from their neighborhoods. It wasn't until there were 6 victims that the police decided the homicides might be connected. They called a press conference.
There are things that we do know. We know that all the children are between certain ages, 8 and 15 years of age. We know that all of the children are black. We know that they all
Responding to the crisis in Atlanta, the FBI sent in some of its most highly trained agents. Agents with a special ability to understand the criminal mind. They are called profilers. Traditional police work hadn't caught the killer. The profilers would try another way. Profilers first became famous in the film Silence of the Lambs. In the movie, a young FBI profiler in training asks convicted killer Hannibal Lecter to help her find an unknown murderer tagged Buffalo Bill.
I'm offering you a psychological profile of Buffalo Bill based on the case evidence. I'll help you catch him, Clarice.
What age group are we talking about?
Jodie Foster's FBI boss in the movie is based on John Douglas, the Bureau's first full-time profiler. He is one of the first to use his knowledge of how serial criminals think and act in order to apprehend them.
She's about 30 to 40 feet alongside of the road.
When the Atlanta case broke, he was pushing the agency into this unconventional approach to catching killers.
The FBI was not embracing this at all. The FBI was kind of standing back in the wings because they were still living under almost like the J. Edgar Hoover belief, don't embarrass the Bureau.
Douglas and a handful of other profilers were operating as a kind of psycho squad out of the basement of the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Police sent them unsolved cases. They analyzed the crime scenes and evidence and sent back psychological profiles of likely suspects. But few knew what they could do in a crunch. For the FBI profilers, the Atlanta child murders would be their proving ground.
And there's one case in particular that I'd like for you to take a look at if you've got a few minutes.
Sure, yeah.
Roy Hazelwood, a colleague of Douglas, was the first profiler on the scene in Atlanta. When he arrived, 7 children had been murdered.
There were only 4 detectives working the case. These guys were truly dedicated, but they were overwhelmed. And so after a couple of weeks there working with them, I contacted the Behavioral Science Unit and says, I need some help. This thing is going to get very, very big.
As publicity built and the international press converged on the city, the pace of the murders increased. Playgrounds grew empty and schoolyards silent as frightened parents kept their sons and daughters indoors. Terror descended on the city. By the time John Douglas joined Hazelwood, the death toll had risen to 16.
It was so emotional down there, and with the media. I mean, the President of the United States was being briefed every day by the Attorney General as to developments in that case.
With all this pressure, the profilers knew they had to be right. The future of criminal profiling hung in the balance. Adding to the horror of the murders, Atlanta was rife with rumors that the killer was a white racist or a group like the Ku Klux Klan, bent on racial extermination. Roy Hazelwood was touring a victim's neighborhood in the back of a squad car when he noticed a simple but telling fact.
There was a black officer with me in the back seat, and there were 2 black officers in the front. And we turned down one of the streets where a victim had been abducted from. And as soon as we turned on that street, everything shut down. And I said to the detectives, I said, what's going on here? And he said, well, there's a white guy in the neighborhood. And he said, they see that very quickly. And immediately, I came to the conclusion that a black person was responsible for these crimes.
But that's all the profilers knew about the killer. To catch him, they would first have to study his victims and find out what they had in common.
I began to see that these kids, many of them were poor, and they would do anything for $5, which would make them very vulnerable and make it very easy for someone to do the things that they were doing to these children.
We believed he did it with a con, a trick, a ruse.
Searching for more insights into the mind of the killer, the profilers also went to where he had dumped the bodies.
Most people are horrified at the thought of being with a deceased person. So what type of person would feel comfortable in having that deceased person long enough to transport them, carry them, and dispose of them? A person looks at them as garbage. A person looks at them as less than humans, you see. So that gave us some insight into his thought process and into his feelings about himself and feelings about the victims.
They took what they learned and built a profile of the Atlanta child killer.
The profile is a black male
Who would be somewhere in his mid-20s.
We said that he interacted very well with young people.
We felt would have some type of prior criminal history.
An individual who resided alone or with his parent or parents.
Also, we felt he'd be a police buff. We saw a pattern with offenders in the research there.
He lived within proximity of where the crimes were being committed.
North Avenue, west of Ashby Street. So you need to get
He got caught up in the media. Initially, the victims were hidden, but eventually they were displayed alongside the road.
We believe that he, in fact, was playing to the media for attention.
When an official said too much to the press, Douglas felt it could be turned to the investigation's advantage.
The medical examiner was making a statement that, you know, right now we're getting good forensic evidence, but if they end up in water, per se, you know, we would have difficulty. I felt that now he's going to dump a kid in the Chattahoochee River.
He advised watching the bridges over the Chattahoochee River, which runs through Atlanta. His hunch proved correct. Bodies began washing up on the riverbanks. Victims were stripped to their underwear, another way of removing trace evidence. Once surveillance began, nothing happened. Discouraged, officials set May 22nd as the last day to watch the rivers. But at 2:30 that morning, a police academy recruit stationed beneath the Jackson Parkway Bridge heard a splash and notified a stakeout on his walkie-talkie. Police pulled a car over. The driver was a 23-year-old black man named Wayne Bertram Williams. Police questioned him and let him go, but didn't lose track of him. 2 days later, a body surfaced downstream. It looked as if the Atlanta police finally had their man. Wayne Bertram Williams was arrested on June 21st, 1981. He claimed he was innocent, but he fit the profile to a T.
He was a police buff. He had the lights on the car, and he also was busted for impersonating a police officer in the past. Later on, which is interesting, what we would find out is he actually showed up at the crime scene and offered to take pictures of the crime scene. He was like a ham operator, and he was running a little radio show. He thought he would be like a manager for like a Jackson 5, a future Jackson 5 type of group. And so he was auditioning with these kids, and these were the kids that he was killing.
Convinced Williams was the killer, Douglas now offered his help to the prosecution. He devised a strategy to convince the jury that this apparently mild-mannered man was the monster who had terrorized Atlanta.
John studied Wayne Williams once he became known. And John learned things about Wayne Williams that other people didn't know. He told the prosecutor in that case he's going to get sick tomorrow. He won't show up for the trial. And Wayne Williams got sick the next day and didn't show up for the trial.
He wanted to control what was happening here, and he wanted sympathy, and I knew he was going to do this.
Douglas was at the trial when Williams testified in his own defense. His lawyers made much of their client's unthreatening demeanor.
Hey, Wayne, how do you feel?
Look at his hands, the defense said. These look like the hands of a serial killer. Look at him. It looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Look at this. It just isn't a serial killer. Like, you know, a serial killer is supposed to look like something.
Douglas told prosecutors how to turn up the heat on cross-examination.
I want you to infringe on his body space. I want you to move in close to his body. I want you to say, what was it like, Wayne, when you wrapped your fingers around that victim's throat? Did you panic, Wayne? Did you panic? I want you to do that.
The ploy worked. The questioning wore away at Williams' self-control, and he lashed back.
He started yelling in the courtroom, and the jurors now, for the first time, saw this so-called Pillsbury Doughboy with his rage. He stood up. That he proved to the jurors that he has this propensity for violence. He has this anger.
Williams was convicted of 2 of the murders and sentenced to life in prison.
No question he killed the ones he was found guilty of. And no question in our minds that he killed most of the others. We feel very comfortable that the right person's in jail for the Atlanta child murders.
For Douglas and Hazelwood, their success in the Atlanta child murders case meant profiling at the FBI was here to stay. What they learned about Williams would also help them continue their journey into the dark world of some of America's most dangerous criminals.
You've heard me say over and over again,
profiling was born to help solve a rising tide of serial killings in America. The killers, drawn by a sexual obsession or other twisted longing, prey on total strangers. They kill and kill again, and leave few clues behind.
There are many cases where these serial offenders don't leave fingerprints behind. They don't leave hairs or fibers or even DNA. So we have to look at other kinds of evidence, evidence that we can't photograph, that we can't scrape, that we can't suck into a tube.
Any similar or related events going on in and around this time?
No, there have been none, and it's a rural area.
At the FBI, agents skilled in homicide investigation and criminal psychology learned how to read the evidence the killers can't hide.
And this is behavioral evidence. It's there. As we hone our skills, we're able to better develop just what that evidence is, and we can link cases, and together can come up with a portrait of the true criminal.
Well, I think that covers...
The number of profilers here at the FBI has grown from the handful at the time of the Atlanta child murders to dozens today.
What about the wound, Tim? Is there any type of a weapon you may be able to theorize was used?
Yeah, they're one of many. It could have been anything from a baseball bat to a club.
All of them know how killers and rapists think and act, and can offer local police assistance catching and convicting them.
The police are the ones who apprehend the offenders. They're the ones who do the bulk of the work. We take what they have done, and now we apply our knowledge to what they have done in an attempt to assist them. What we're dealing with is not a science, it's an art.
And that's where the body was found. This is where the victim's car was where the victim was abducted from.
Douglas and Hazelwood learned that to create a profile of a killer, you must first recreate his crime.
Yeah, there's no effort to conceal or just display. So sooner or later,
she was tossed out. She was dumped, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, she was dumped.
It's a heck of a case. So, shame. They tried to walk in the shoes of the victim, tried to experience from the victim's perspective of what that victim was experiencing at the time by analyzing how she died. And then I tried to visualize the type of person who's capable of committing that type of crime, because I've interviewed those types of people.